Hello everybody and welcome to the Drawing Zelda Part 2 video. I am your host, I'm an elf, and we are in Kikaraku Forest, Kiko. We're in Cuckoo Forest, and I'm going to be going through the next part of the process. There's only a little bit left. This video is going to be a little under an hour, but after that, I'm going to be covering the final stages of it, but that'll be in the next video. Not too much longer though. That one will be pretty short, probably around maybe hovering around this same time, but look forward to that. But in the meantime, let's jump back into where we left off. Okay. So this is me just kind of picking up, drawing the final lines for the body. There's nothing too crazy here. I mean, I like to go little tiny noodly details. I like to go have, these microscopic things that nobody sees and draw these itty bitty lines that just add a bit of texture to the body. But most of that doesn't really show. And this is sped up double time. So double time. That feels like a 1984 reference. But I'm doing the shield details, and mostly what I do with like any kind of little tiny inking details is I'm mostly just implying through little scribbles. I'm trying to more or less render some light and dark elements that feel like wood, that feel like metal, replicating texture as best I can from memory. But most of that can be done through studying reference and studying materials. I mean, I didn't go right ahead and draw every material. That's not how I learn those things. You can learn them however you want. Like, you can learn them through painting, you can learn them through drawing, you can learn them through observation, application in your paintings, application in your drawings from observation. Like, there's a lot of ways to get that stuff down, but for me, I don't really have some like history of going and drawing every single piece of everything, drawing a belt buckle and studying it and learning how it works. And I more think in terms of lighting objects in three-dimensional space. If you want to see more on that, I have that previous video up of where I drew Ganon's hand and rendered it within the forms, and I think that that's probably the simplest way to explain kind of how I'm just thinking of each little piece as a wire mesh 3D form without really thinking so much about specifically what each texture is, although that does play a part in how I'm rendering like cracks, or I'm rendering textures of like little divots in the bumps in like a piece of leather, or yeah, I mean, in cloth, I have a more like smooth approach to it. So it's essentially the same thing with little observations as to what is different about each one of those textures. So that's most of what I'm doing here. And aside from that, just refining the lines that are there in this piece from the sketch. Like, more or less with this approach, it's just the kind of discipline to stay in your seat and just keep on going. It's not so much that it's difficult past this stage. Like, it is in that you have to do it. It's difficult in the way that like you're just there now and you're gonna have to draw this thing for hours. Like, that's the hardest part, is being like, how do I sit in this seat and only do this for hours and hours and hours? Because in my mind, I'm like, this doesn't take me that long, but that's not true. It's not that it doesn't take me very long to draw. It's that it just doesn't feel like that work intensive in the way that I'm like thinking about everything as I do it. It's so mindless for me because I'm just doing these little tiny things that build up forms slowly. And when I'm doing that, it's kind of just like a automated thing. Like, once the bones of the drawing are there, once that sketch is done, if I don't feel like there's anything immediately broken with the anatomy, or broken with the design, broken with the shapes, broken with the tools and little items and things, then I don't really care. Like, I just start rendering, and as long as I know where my light source is and I know what each form is and how to render the light wrapping around it from light to dark, it's like that information's the important bit. And I have that locked in. So then I go in and execute, and the execution of the whole thing is just so boring. Like most artists that I know who are professional, non-professional, whatever, or who start with a drawing phase, like a strong drawing phase, they love the sketching process. They love the idea bit. They love coming up with a composition. And then when it comes to the execution, they're like, oh, this is where I get bored. Like, this is the most boring part. And I feel like that's universal through everybody. So it's more about just like keeping yourself honed in on where you're going. Like, you have this idea of what the final's going to be. How do I get there? It's like, you just sit and make it happen, and hopefully just through the dedication of it, you get there. And I always kind of second guess myself. I always like question whether or not I'm doing the right thing. I question whether or not it's going to come out good. And what I ended up realizing was I really just need to shake that completely and not really care so much about it just being a perfectly rendered, perfectly realized, perfectly referenced piece, and just get it out, move on to the next thing, do the best you can with the abilities you have. But I'm trying to really just create momentum. I'm trying to create this discipline of getting things done. I'm just trying to focus on repetition. Just keep moving, keep getting through these kinds of drawings, keep getting through these kinds of pieces. And then on the other side of all that, hopefully I've learned all of those lessons and grown. It's like, I might not, like, there's stuff about this where, like, I read nice comments when I posted up this Zelda piece with Link, and I didn't agree with a lot of it, like saying that the hands are good. Like, the hands aren't good. The hands are bad. And, there's lots of broken bits. I don't really know what his legs are doing. Like, I mean, you probably saw me playing with the sketch. It's like, I didn't have a wholly formed idea of the whole thing. I figured it out as I went. And like I said, doing something that was just for you all. I wanted to just create something that was loose and fun and a way to demonstrate how I do inking. But I wasn't going for perfection, and I had that mindset throughout. It's just, okay, let's share the technique. Let's go through the technique. And then, yeah, I do the best I can, even when I see a ton of flaws, because, I find it more important to keep the motivation alive, to keep the momentum, to keep the feeling of like, I don't have a million loose ends. I don't have all of these things I haven't wrapped up. I don't have, what job didn't I do? What idea did I have that I never finished? Whatever. Like, so many of those exist in my mind that I don't need more things doing that. So every piece I start, I finish now. And I've been that way for a while. And that resulted in a crazy amount of pieces getting done. I think just in the past 12 months, I mentioned it in the Q&A. I did 80 illustrations, some complex, some kind of normal, nothing too wild, some single character, some not. But I did 80 illustrations in the past year, and I honestly can't even believe I did like 200 pages of comics in 12 months, and with the 80 illustrations. So it's like, just having that mindset of push through, get it done, don't be precious. Push through, get it done, don't be precious. Just get it out. Do the best you can through the process, but don't constantly rewind and fix and rewind and check and whatever. It's like, if I'm not doing that in my sketch, then I need to be putting more thought into the sketch. That's kind of how I approach it. All of those mistakes I made happened in the sketch. So I need to get better at identifying that when I'm doing that. So that's what my mindset is going forward. When I'm executing, I'm executing. It is what it is. I did the best I could in that sketch, and if I fucked up, I fucked up. That's my fault. I'll learn from it and I'll grow and I'll move on. But I'm not going to hold myself to this crazy standard and beat myself up about it. And I used to do that, and then nothing got done. So when you see me doing these and if I tell you like I don't like something, it doesn't mean I'm like I didn't see it even when I was doing it. Like I saw that hand and I was like, "Oh, that's not that great." And, I eventually fixed it to some extent through the inking, but I didn't do anything new to it. I didn't try to adjust too much. Yeah. I'm looking at what I'm doing now. I can't remember. I was looking over here while I was just talking. So I can't remember exactly what I did. I think I did that arm and it wasn't very good. The arm that's now gone that was there a second ago. I didn't like the way it looks, so I did a slightly refined sketch and adjusted for a new design and then just fixed it because it was too ugly. Um, but yeah, that's the layering up of the underdrawing with the sketch beneath that, and then the loose thumbnail sketch beneath that. And certain parts will be more refined than others when I'm working through that process. Like the face is usually the thing. The face is usually defined in the sketch. Like that's the furthest along. I put the most thought into it. And then I try to do that with the hands too, so that I'm not redrawing that whole thing. But because, like I said, made this thing as a quick presentation, I did rush some parts and needed to do further refinement sketches underneath. But once you're in that final, let's get through this process of inking like I am now, you don't want to be constantly checking and not finishing and just reworking and reworking. You can do that, but my mindset is not to do that. My mindset is to just get it out, hope for the best, hope I learned what I could, and move on. And then I go out into the woods and I find myself an elf village, and I'm the little boy without the fairy. And then all the other elves in the village are like, "What are you doing here? You big dumb fuck, stupid, fucking not elf human being." And I'm like, "What? I thought that I was one of you." And they're like, "Nah, take out your penis. That doesn't look like an elf's penis. None of us are circumcised." And I'm like, "Really?" And they're like, "Yeah." And then they're like, "What are you, Jewish?" And I'm like, "I'm Portuguese. I'm also an elf." And then, I go into the big hollowed out log and I fight a spider. But yeah, I'm listening to the Zelda soundtrack right now. So I just felt like I was there for a second. I still feel like I'm there. It's a great soundtrack. The Ocarina of Time one. God. I get so nostalgic for some of that stuff. Like the nerdy thing of like Song of Storms, and then I come back to being a little kid. I remember playing those games, just like zoning out, drawing everything from the guide that it came with, looking at all that artwork, and just kind of loving how developed that world was. There's something about that time period when like games weren't fully realized worlds yet. That like RPG, action RPG thing wasn't so prevalent like it is now, where like every game has that. Like back then, that game was just, it stood above so much. Yeah, that was a great time. I played that game so many times in a row. It had such a great vibe. Like even like the new versions, the ones that came out for like 3DS, the Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time, those ones were like too clean for me. Like they're fine, but too clean, and maybe like the lack of the muddiness that the N64 had. Maybe that created like a different, grosser atmosphere. But when you play the old N64 one on like a CRTV, it just has this like shittiness to it that makes it feel a little creepier and darker. And that's my like nostalgic memory, as I'm sure whatever you grow up with is the thing that you like the most. But there's something about shitty quality that creates this really nice feeling to it. I put it in the same lane as like noise from old VHSs in a VCR. So like old VHS tapes, when you'd watch like a movie from the 80s and it had that bad quality, when that bad quality was layered over top the special effects, there was this distance between you and the special effect that made the effect kind of blend a bit more. So it looked better when you saw it that way versus now where like you watch those movies in Blu-ray and you can just see too much. It looks like shittier. It looks like the some of that sleight of hand noise of the visual thing, it's gone. So you don't have that convincingness to it. I noticed that with I've tested that theory because I would do like when I did the original Skull and Shark trailer. If you've never seen that, you can go to YouTube and type Skull and Shark Dave Raposa and you'll find it. It's like a Sega Genesis arcade homage to, you know, like old fighting games and things. And it's for the comic that my buddy Dan and I wrote together called Skull and Shark. And what I did with that was I would do these really shitty paintings that weren't very good. And then to kind of homogenize everything, like make the image feel together, I would I would blend it all by first of all doing a mosaic pixelated filter over the whole thing to make it feel pixelated like a video game. And then I would export it as a GIF image, and the GIF image would be a lower amount of colors. So it would be from like 256 colors down to like 32. And that would kind of make all of them bleed together and blend a bit. And then I'd add like noise on top of that and then resave it again. So it would go through like a few layers of almost just like shitifying it, just making it shittier and shittier and shittier until the bad paintings disappeared and the bad effects and the bad photo integration and all that. It just kind of blended together. And I think that those old things feel like that to me. So like the old N64 Zelda, like so much of that, I don't know, feels good on like the older stuff. But you know, it's whatever they designed it for, right? So whatever medium you design for, that's probably what it'll look best as. Like, you ever see that thing of the old PlayStation games with the CRTV versus non-CRTV on like an emulator? It's crazy how different that looks. It looks so much better, in my opinion, on a CRTV because you hide so much of the jaggedy ugliness and it kind of makes it a bit softer, blurry, so it has a nice glow to it. Yeah, that stuff is coming back though. I see it a lot in art and I see it a lot in like little shorter kind of indie movie things. Like they use that effect a lot to blend things. Like if you ever seen like Kung Fury, a lot of the effects that are uglier, they're like hidden behind those kinds of like filters and noise. It's a nice trick to employ if you're trying to do something like the Skull and Shark or make something that feels, I don't know, authentically of a time or whatever. Yeah, look at me rendering this belt. I do think a lot about the like wrapping, rendering, shaping out the form of like the leather on the belt and then how the what would you call it? The things on your belt, the belt loops. That was so hard to figure out. Who knows? Somehow I didn't know what a belt loop was. Yeah, I use those all as like elements to make the form read, make it look a bit better. And I feel like here where I'm adding Link's little spell book. I think adding books. I don't know what it is about that. Maybe it's from like old Warhammer stuff. But whenever I see like huge books strapped to characters, I always like that. I don't know why, but it just looks so cool to me. I like the idea that a character is carrying around a lot of the things you get in the game. I always thought that that was neat. And I talked about that before about how old games where the best part of some of the best games, in my opinion, was that you would see the change from the items you get. So I love that. And I love that the original Nintendo Link had that. And I really like doing that with this one because I don't see a lot of links that are accessorized like this, where he has all this shit on him. I think that looks neat. So it's fun to just go in and do all of that. Give him potions, give him sacks of rupees, all that. Yeah. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last one, but I went on my own Link adventure when I was a kid. And what happened to me was I was out in the Mystic Forest with my friend Corey, and we had just gotten done playing, and we ran out into this bog road, and we saw these two people walking towards me and towards us, and they were going like this, like, come over here, dressed like the boxcar clowns. I know I told this in a Q&A, and then I took my slingshot and I shot him right between the eyes, and he went, oh, oh, or, some other N64 sound. No, that didn't happen. We just ran, and then found out later that they were real kidnappers looking for real little kids to take, which was pretty wild. But nothing happened. We just ran away from them because they were dudes, obviously dressed like clowns in the woods. I think about that so much because I'm like, in what universe do you dress up like a clown in the woods and somehow people go for that? Like a little kid, like kids are scared of clowns anyways, but like hobo clowns, like the classic train cart hobo clown wanderer with the sack over his shoulder, like that's not something you want. That's not something you want to be around. Like, what were they thinking? It was never going to work. That was never going to happen. It's so stupid. Yeah. That was back when I was a little boy without a fairy. Ugh. I had such an imagination as a little kid. I wanted to do stuff like this so bad. Like, I feel like sometimes I'm dishonest with myself. Like, well, I mean, it's different because the magic is kind of not the same. When you're a little kid and you see certain artwork from certain games, like I would look at like the artwork from like Darkstalkers and see like, or the artwork from like Breath of Fire or the Final Fantasy games, and you just wish that you could do that. Like for me, I would wish that I could do the Yoshitaka Mono stuff. I would wish that I could draw enough to design those things and in a way inhabit those worlds. And when I was little, I would have done anything to have that. But it's funny now to have the ability to be able to paint and draw that stuff and not have that excitement that you had when it was almost a shame that I don't have that same thing. Like, I wish I could go back and grab that a bit and pull it in and show old me like what it would have been like to realize those things and just be like, you end up doing it. You do the thing. So keep that excitement alive. It's going to happen. It's only a matter of working hard. That is weird because when I was a kid, I did everything I could to kind of be a part of it. Whatever I was a fan of, I wasn't a fan of it peripherally. And there wasn't like a thing of cosplaying back then. That didn't exist. There wasn't like a heritage of that. It was just me being a kid in a tiny town. And I remember when Pokemon came out when I was in the third grade, I want to say. I was pretty young. I would take baseballs and paint them to be Pokeballs. And that's how I played Pokemon outside. I would throw them at nothing. Like, I want to tell you that I threw them at like animals' heads and stuff and just just busted their skulls open. I didn't do that. But I definitely painted baseballs to be like Pokeballs, and I would throw them at nothing and make believe a Pokemon came out. And then I don't know what I did. I probably just talked to nothing and told it things to do. and just use my imagination. But I had a lot of like weapons that I'd make. My dad, he had a buffer wheel in his workshop, and we would flatten old pipes and sharpen them and make all kinds of different weapons. And I would show him like designs from games, and we'd try and figure it out. And he would use old lighting parts to create like hilts for swords and all kinds of stuff like that, and like sheaths. And then I would be this little wild kid out in the woods with like a bow and arrow and swords and all kinds of weapons, and that was how I played. And I just tried my best to be a part of those universes I wanted to be a part of, because I was secretly a nerd, and I don't think I didn't want to be a nerd, so I wasn't ashamed of it, but I definitely didn't tell anybody, or I definitely didn't have a lot of friends who were into the same things. And I remember one time, not like just I didn't talk about it a lot, but I remember one time going over to my friend's house, my friend Kevin, when I was a kid, and he was playing Super Mario RPG, and I remember thinking like, "Oh my god, no kids play RPGs. Kevin's a secret nerd like me." And then I never told Kevin that I also played RPGs. I waited until I had an entirely new friend group, and what we bonded over was those things. Like my writing partner Dan, he he was big into Suikoden 2, and that's how we became friends. We just started like, well, that's not the only thing that happened, but we both drew. We were both artists in the school, and we just started talking about things that we liked. And one time we hopped on a phone call. I don't remember. I think I just got his number in school, and I was like, "Hey, we both draw. Let's do something." And then yeah, we started talking. We started talking about Suikoden 2, and it was such a specific video game reference, and like we were both obsessed with it, and we just talked about it for like hours. And I think it was the first time either one of us had gotten really nerdy comfortably around somebody else. And yeah, that's when like we became best friends. And when I think back on all of those times, I'm like, I want to tell that little kid that you end up doing that stuff. You end up doing games, you end up working on movies, you end up making your own things. You get diarrhea pretty often. You get diarrhea a lot. You get diarrhea so much it might be a problem. So stop eating certain foods, and stop putting it off. Go to the doctor and figure out what it is. Go to a nutritionalist. That's what I would tell them. Also, that all of the good things happen, but the diarrhea is very serious, and unfortunately, you do nothing about it. It is, October 2020, and you still haven't done anything about it. You still get diarrhea, even if you sniff a Twix bar. Go and smell a Twix bar, and you're going to get diarrhea. You're going to be dead. You're going to die. And then he'd be scared. I mean, he'd probably be scared that he just saw me from the future. That'd be enough. He wouldn't remember anything I said. But yeah, it is weird. Life is really crazy. I wish I could tell you some of the things that didn't happen that I worked on that just never came to fruition. I hope someday when I'm like older, I can talk about, stuff that just is so far in the past that I won't get in trouble for mentioning it. Well, the Master Sword. I made up my own kind of Master Sword design. It's based on the Master Sword from Ocarina and then something else, but then I just did my own emblems on it, did my own little ornate designs. You got to do your own thing a little bit here and there. It has to have a bit of your signature. You see that line tool there? I love that about Clip. I don't know how you shut off the pressure sensitivity of the brush in Photoshop for the straight line tool, but I just don't like how it tapers at the end. So here I like in Clip that it's just a straight line at that same exact size. It just makes sense to me. So that level of control is nice whenever I can use it for weapons or different, like, more structural things in perspective. It's an awesome tool to have. Yeah, man. At nights like this, on nights like this, I think back to a lot of those old days. I think to, getting shot at in the woods. I think about going on little adventures with my friends. I'm glad that I did a bunch of stuff as a kid. I'm glad I have a ton of old, like, warm memories. I think that's important to do a shit ton of stuff, because if you don't and you end up doing something like I'm doing, or really any kind of whatever professional thing that you end up going for, it's like if you don't have all of those things in the background to pull from, then you don't really have I don't know, like a history, because so much of what I do now, I'm making new memories with my family, but I don't like risk my life like I used to. Just kind of do, normal stuff and have fun with my son. Eventually I'm sure my son will do crazier shit and I'll have to have heart attacks watching that happen, or maybe I'll just be like, good for you, you're nuts. But yeah, it's nice to not feel like I'm missing something because I'm sitting all the time working on stuff like this, just drawing. Which, the grass is greener kind of thing. I feel like I would have been that way. I would have been like, I regret not doing more weird stuff. Because then I feel like I wouldn't have as much fun writing. Because writing is such a big part of that. It's like what you have in your history. That's a lot of what you pull from. A lot of the, characters you end up doing are from your past. Those kinds of things. Oh, what I'm doing here is adding that texture-y brush that's noisy. The one that's, I want to say it's attached to the first part of this video process on Patreon, that post that's up there. When I'm using that brush, it's just to add a bit of a gradient noise to the whole thing. You can see how it just gives it a little bit of shading. But yeah, I like the way that looks, and I use it a lot towards the end of my inking. I just add in shadows and all that, and I think that it just gives a cool effect to the whole thing. Well, that video part ended, so let's jump into this one. Yeah, then what I have left for this, now that Link is done, and whenever I finish the character, I just feel so much relief. Finishing a character in an illustration, like when that's like the crux of the whole thing. Oh, it's like, oh, finally. Now I can just do whatever on the rest of this and feel good. Feel a bit of freedom. Because as long as it reads as woods, as long as it reads as leaves, I'm in the clear. So I'm just rendering based on the light source, and then I'm just detailing out plants. These are just from my imagination, but I found that, the reason I can do that from imagination with some plants, at least, is because I went through a phase where I bought a bunch of plants. So we have a bunch of plants out here that I take care of, and I had like what is it, like 6 or so bonsai trees, and they're just beautiful. And looking at them every day and taking care of them, I feel like that was enough to kind of cement the language of how they move and how the plants grow, and just how the leaves stack and how they change depending on how the light changes. All of those things ended up standing out in my mind. if I were to simply use reference for those things, I don't think it would have the same effect. I think it's nice to have a lot of what you are going to be referencing around you, because that makes it easier to have a stronger understanding of how to then, draw a scene like that. You can do little things like plants turning towards light and all that, make it feel even more real. And then you just understand the structure of the trees and of the bushes, plants, flowers, whatever. So I found that that was really helpful, just to take care of plants, have them in the house. So when I'm doing these, it's a lot of just quickly working through, because I've looked at them so many times. So it's very easy for me to just wing it and fly through it. And in this, I'm going for so much detail from the plants that it just feels like a forest. I just want it to feel like a big lush forest, just detail on detail on detail. Like, I love that about looking into forests myself. It's like the whole thing of being like engulfed by the woods. I don't like sparse forests. I like when they're very dense and layered. I think that creates a really nice sense of depth, and it feels warm to me. It reminds me of like Miyazaki movies. Like, Miyazaki backgrounds are something to aspire to for me, because when I look at those and I see how the woods come across, they're so inviting, and like it brings out that little kidness of like, oh, I want to go out and I want to play in this forest. So if I can get even a hint of that in my work, I feel like that's really important. Because you can't, like, I think about this with stories. So doing comics, when you design characters and you write a story and you write dialogue and you try and make them relatable and you try and make them like you and you try and get across how you feel about things, or jokes, or just, your opinion on people, or how you work through a problem, whatever. It's like so much connection between you and the reader, that people actually have a grasp on who you are a bit as the person writing it. So there's that connection, and people just become more wrapped around a story. And then it's like, how can you ever do that in an illustration? But I find that some illustrations do that for me, and I think that that's kind of the case with the Miyazaki stuff, where like Studio Ghibli, really, not Miyazaki in particular. But when you look at the backgrounds of those, even as just singular illustrations, they're just so inviting. There's such a warmth to them. There's such a story there. It feels so alive. It feels like it wasn't made for the movie. It feels like it already was there, and that there already is a story there. Like, you're not just peeking into a thing and feeling like, oh, this was made for me. It's like, no, it feels like you're watching a thing happen. So I try to keep that in mind now doing things. It's like, how many pieces of culture and just like a collection of items, or a sense of a world that already existed without you, like, how can I get that across and make something inviting, or at least just something that feels a bit more alive and memorable, I guess, like a story is. But I think that that's my, outside of structural things and outside of narrative and like what's going on in an image, I think that that's one of the hardest things to get across, is being memorable. Like, I don't know how you do that in an illustration so well. Like, I'm trying, but I think it's difficult to nail down, because once you've had a taste of that from doing comics, you're like, I don't know if I could ever make somebody feel that same way with an illustration. Like, people don't become Like they do become a fan of an illustration, but it doesn't feel the same. It's not that same total connection to characters because it has so much like emotion behind it. It's really interesting. So I always wonder if that's doable or how you can at least get close to that because that seems really difficult. Yeah, I have to sneeze. It's not coming. Is a sneeze coming? I don't know. What was I gonna say? Yeah, one of the things that I've been planning on for this Patreon is while I'm doing these illustrations, I'm also going to start working on comics again. Start knocking out the kind of bucket list of comics I want to produce. Get them all out there and then be satisfied. I don't want to leave this earth having not done all the things I said I was going to do. And also having the best of me be locked behind these things I didn't let myself do. Because there are projects I haven't done yet. And then what if I wait too long to do those and I don't do the thing that comes after that? That is what I learned as a culmination of doing all of those other jobs. I mean, all of those other books. And then that next thing becomes the thing that is more clearly who you are, who I am. So I'm trying to get that across for the next year. So 2021, I'm moving away from clients. I'm going to focus on selling my artwork as prints alongside this Patreon. And then while the Patreon will still have the same illustrations, the same kinds of videos and everything else, it'll also have another layer of comics, comic process, story, all of that. So that's my idea, is to see how many of those I can get done in 2021, which I think will be a lot because I've kind of been testing myself on different ways of executing books. And I still, like I said, doing the 80 illustrations, I was able to also do 200 pages of comic. So if all I'm doing is comics and the Patreon, then I think that I'll be able to do at least like 300 to 400 pages over that 12-month period, which should be a decent chunk of stuff. I'm looking forward to that. I'm really excited. I've been writing a bunch. So you can see here, I've been doing a lot of script work, a ton of it. I'm pretty excited because I did like a bunch of drafts of dialogue and things for the basketball manga, which I think is going to be something. I read it to Dan, writing partner, because this is just me doing something on my own, and he was like, I don't know, can you do that on Patreon? And I was like, I think so. I mean, Sakimi-chan's on Patreon. I think I can do whatever I want. And he was like, okay. I just want to make sure that you don't get in trouble. And I'm like, get in trouble for a basketball manga? What do you think it is? No, but it did get pretty dark. I didn't realize how dark it was getting. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like Link himself is so detailed that I don't need to do too much for the background. But what I'm trying to create is a sense of contrast between the two. So with Link there, he's pretty bright. He's not super dark. So I want the background immediately behind him, like towards his waist and down. I want that to be much darker details. So there's not going to be a ton of light. There's going to be more plants. There's going to be more shadows in there so that Link then pops forward. But if Link were really dark, then I would do the opposite of that. I would have a brighter background. So you'll see that as this comes together, that it's a big cluster of just densely packed dark leaves and grass and bushes, and then some implied areas and some straight up chunks of pure black ink. But yeah, yeah. No, I feel good about it. I finished the Ganon piece. I took a break from doing this part 2 almost unwittingly because I wanted to get out the next image, as I had the idea to do Ganon, and I just felt like might as well just start it and get it out. But it took me a little bit longer than I thought, so I was like, oh shit, I gotta hop back and do this video too, because I said I would and show you the whole process. But sometimes it gets away from me because when I was doing this one, so much of the detail is implied, and it's not very specific. And like I said about the bad drawing, I had a rougher drawing there, so I thought, oh, on this Ganon piece I won't do that. I'll do like a tighter sketch. I'll make sure that a lot of the problems I faced in this one I won't be facing again. But in turn, I made more work for myself because those things became more rendered, more realized, and then yeah, just developed from there. So that's why this took a bit longer than I thought it would, for sure. Another thing I did to separate Link from the background is I just did a rim lighting around his whole shape. I find that that's just the easy way to break it up, instead of it feeling too messy, because with this style you can go so far with the details and the inking that things get kind of ugly, like bleeding together. So I don't want them to bleed together too much. So if I can just create an outline around Link to clearly separate him from the rest of the background elements, it just makes an easier read, easier to see Link, and I think it looks better. But yeah, that's why I'm doing that, because I feel when something's so busy, you want as much, help there as possible for people seeing it, so they're clearly seeing the work you put in and not just a tangled mess. Which is easy to do. I've done it so many times. Like what I'm doing now with this inking style is a lot like what I would have loved to have done as a kid, because I got really into inking after seeing my buddy from my buddy Dan when he was drawing in high school. I saw his inked work, and he was big into Amano, Yoshitaka Amano, and some of Yoshitaka Amano's inks were just incredible. So we thought that the way to get close to that was to draw every single little tiny detail like I am now, but just poorly. So instead of having any understanding of balance between light and dark, and balance between shape, and balance between areas where you breathe, it's just not crazy detailed, and then areas where it's detailed, and then clear shape language and clear compositions, none of that existed. So the whole thing needed to be full. The plants needed to be every leaf, and then the armor needed to have every link of chainmail, the hair, every piece of hair on a character's head, and then the whole gradient of the sky in the background, and then all the wisps of the clouds. Like everything was defined, and it looked horrible. But I was so proud of myself every time I did it. I was like, this is the shit. I should try and find some of that. I would love to figure out where any of that went. It may still be with me somewhere. I'm not sure. I know that some of the anime stuff I did exists still. Like if you go to DeviantArt and you search for Mr. Delicious 666, which I know is the most teenage AOL Instant Messenger name ever, but that's what it was. And you go there, you'll see some of the really cool old anime stuff I did. Some of my first posts on the internet, really. That's the earliest I had, where I got like that was when I had my earliest Wacom tablet. Oh no, that's not true. The ones that are up there are ones I did with just the mouse. So tablets were only a thing for like industry people. Like you had to learn about tablets. I didn't, like nobody used them unless they knew anything about real digital art and were a professional. It wasn't like a casual thing you just had back then. So I think this was in 2003 or yeah, like 2003 or 2004. But I got my first one and it was a really tiny tablet, like this big kind of thing. I think it was like $100. That was like when I broke away from the mouse, and that was that was right before I graduated. And what I got for graduation, instead of, I was going to get an art scholarship, but because I couldn't afford to go to school, I asked for money, and I guess they couldn't give me money directly for some reason. So they asked me what I wanted, and I was like, oh, I want the big Wacom tablet. So I got that. And then I started doing digital artwork for real when I was, I don't know, 17. And then I didn't really get serious about it till I was 19. But that's the beginnings. The beginnings are online. Most of my beginnings are online. There's just a whole marker period of time where I was doing Dragon Ball Z artwork and Trigun and a few things like that. That there was a time period where that's what I did in high school. Old comics based on all that stuff. Tons of that. I should try and find it. It would be fun to do, like take this camera and do like a overhead thing of my old sketchbooks and then show you everything I used to do so that you can laugh. But yeah, this was Zelda Drawing Link Part 2. Zelda as in just the video game, not Princess Zelda. And then the next piece I'll do is probably Princess Zelda. And then I'm not really calling it like, Dan said, am I going to do like a Triforce trifecta? I was like, well, I will never say those words and not want to beat myself to death. So no, I won't do that. But I'm kind of leaving it open. I don't mind the inking style. I feel like it's so fun to do that I could easily do more of these. I could easily jump in and make, some other characters, because I would like to do that. There's so many from Zelda that would, I think, benefit from having that like old school, like pen and ink RPG feel. So look forward to that. And also part 3 of this will be up, and I will be doing another illustration as well to follow along with. It's going to be painted, and soon I'm going to be laying out comic stuff. When I'm done with this first issue here that I'm writing, I'm going to get going on it, and that's going to be the basketball manga, which is, I feel like it's probably going to be a lot different than you're thinking. But yeah, look forward to all of that, and I'll talk to you soon. But as always, trying to see where my button is. Thanks for supporting this Patreon. Thanks for supporting my family and I. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you had a good Halloween if you celebrate Halloween. And if you don't, then I just hope you had a good night or day, and I'll talk to you in the next video. Okay. Goodbye.